I felt for some time now we no longer have a Westminster model of government in the UK. Unfortunately, we're all labouring with a Westminster muddle. I want to get into some of this today and share my thoughts about what we can do to turn the situation around. In part, my comments are sparked by some recent tweets by Zia Youssef, the lead for Reform UK on Doge UK, which stands for Department of Government Efficiency, and it's inspired by the US model under Donald Trump. And this is, what Zia has been talking about, and he's absolutely right, is the need to, for any incoming reform government in the future is going to have a lot of challenges. But the biggest challenge, without which there is none, the sine qua non challenge of getting our mission delivered, is to reform the civil service and the quangocracy, to take back control, to reassert the primacy of elected party government in the UK. And we used to call this, in the British political tradition, it's called the responsible party of government tradition. Responsible party government. And it's been eroded. It's been systematically eroded over many years since the fall of Margaret Thatcher. And some of that is accidental, some of it is very much by design. And some of it comes back to Tony Blair, but a lot actually happened under Gordon Brown. I want to get into some of this now. Look, I am not the country's leading constitutional scholar by any means, but these are my observations, and people are absolutely free to disagree. I'm hoping that you'll enjoy my remarks, and I'm hoping that you'll check out the rest of my channel. My name is Daniel Cremin. I'm the host of Cremin's Corner, and I set up this channel recently on YouTube to kind of draw on my background in public affairs and policy analysis to share ideas and also analysis. And this is very much an episode or a video about ideas and about history and what's gone wrong with the British Constitution in over time. And there are people who are better placed to talk about this with great academic expertise, like David Starkey, I'm sure. But I'm just going to give you my own sort of perspective. You can check out his channel and see what he has to say about it. But this is just my raw take, and I may get a few things wrong. We all do in life, but here goes. So look, what went wrong is we lost the core principle of civil service neutrality, and the idea that there is self-restraint on the part of those in the senior civil service, which is the upper cadre, in terms of how political they choose to be. Now, I'm not saying that everything was perfect before 1997 and that there had been no politicisation. And some people trace it back to sort of, Margaret Thatcher and even Ted Heath's era, the kind of growing fusion of senior civil servants working more closely with political appointees. Some people claim it goes that far back. For me, though, I think it's fair to say that something fundamentally changed after 1997. Look, how have we ended up where we are? Well, we under Tony Blair, there was an emphasis on, increasingly hiving power out of the core executive into quangocracies, into the quangos, I should say, and they call it the quangocracy. I'll get my terms right. And the quangocracy has grown and grown and grown, as has the outsourcing of a lot of activity that was traditionally done by the state to a mixture of charities and private consultancies. We've also seen, the erosion of unitary Westminster government. That was a key feature of the Westminster model, the idea that the whole country, essentially had one governing entity. Well, that's something for another time, that the devolution settlements. But what I really want to talk about today is the civil service and the quangocracy and what's gone wrong. And then, of course, this will be very much in the context of England since 1998, when the devolution settlements happened after referendums. A lot has happened in the time since then to change the nature of how we're governed, and not a lot of it's been for the better. So what happened? So by tradition, the civil service, has always had a core principles of impartiality, of neutrality, of being there to serve the government of the day. And that worked very well. There were two characters in the mid-19th century, Northcote and Trevelyan. I believe it was Northcote who was the Chancellor later on, and Trevelyan was the serving permanent secretary of the Treasury. And they set out in a report what became the seminal principles, the convention for how the civil service, as it grew, would operate. It was a really, important foundational moment for the emerging civil service, which by that point in the history of the British Empire was taking on, increasingly a recognisable shape as a permanent administrative, functional entity in British government. And those principles, they lasted for a very long time. They weren't statutory in nature. This is how the British Constitution used to work. Very much on understanding, on tradition. It didn't all have to be sort of set out in great legal detail. Now, unfortunately, over time, you know, modern governments, they like to have everything set down in law, and part and parcel of this comes back to, judicial review really grew up from the sort of 1980s onwards, and some of this comes back to the era of the European Union. Increasingly, the activist courts kind of getting involved in constitutional matters that were, properly under the Westminster Model, the business of Parliament and the core executive. And what do I mean by the core executive, by the way? The core executive refers to central government departments and the cabinet. It's an academic term, but it's a really important one, and I'm probably going to use it a few times in the course of this video. So look, what happened around 1995, a non-statutory instrument called an Ordering Council, that made some updates to the kind of the set of principles that would govern the civil service. And that was the sort of first, this was under the John Major government, but it wasn't revolutionary or anything. Really, the changes happened after 1997 under Tony Blair, and he was emphasising the importance of joined-up government, and Tony brought in lots of czars. Do you remember you used to hear a lot about czars for this and that, and they were coming in to run quangos, they were coming in to run commissions, and some of them were coming in as effectively as civil service appointees from outside the structure of how civil servants were traditionally appointed. And they were increasingly political. And we had this emphasis on joined up government and how, there would be a new way of running government, and quangos would be far more, prominent. And they did just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they became steadily less accountable. Civil servants, they're not really democratically accountable in any meaningful way. We do have something in Parliament called select committees. We have a select committee structure where, our MPs, who are elected representatives, can call together, sessions of the committee to ask civil servants as well as ministers questions, and they can ask those who lead non-departmental public bodies and executive agencies in government, to account for their performance, to account for the policies and the processes. But the civil servants, they don't fear the select committees greatly. They're kind of paper tigers, and most of them are chaired by the elected government of the day. So how radical are they going to be? We don't have anything like the US system, where there's genuine political accountability through their select committee structures. Ours are very hollow by comparison. They just don't have the same teeth. So look, our civil service has never been hyper accountable. The deal was always that the civil service, to an extent kind of gets to sort of shape its own promotion and its structures and how it organises itself professionally, and ministers get to direct it. That was the traditional sort of structure, and the civil service would not get too much into the weeds of party political matters. It would try and stay away from that, and it would focus on helping ministers achieve their goals. But what's increasingly happened is things got muddled, and more civil servants took on more and more political power. And then what happened is, towards the end of the last Labour government, this was after Tony Blair for the most part, you saw under Gordon Brown further attempts to kind of really politicise the workings of the civil service, and you saw under Brown, last sort of gasp, a parting gift from the man. He passed in 2010, I think it was in April. Yes, it was during the parliamentary wash-up, just before the election. He finally rammed through a Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. And this is called the CRAG for short. Now, look, the CRAG was the first attempt to formally codify the functions, the powers, and the independence to an extent, the autonomy in terms of how it operates of the civil service from the elected government of the day. It set up what is known as the Civil Service Commission to particularly oversee HR matters, to oversee particularly appointments of the senior civil service, particularly permanent secretaries. So technically, the Prime Minister does appoint, the cabinet secretary and permanent secretaries, but a lot of it is done by the Civil Service Commission. A lot of the practical work, and then they make their recommendations based on the panel and the permanent secretaries, and are all appointed in this manner. The Prime Minister kind of says yes, okay, or no, think again. But in reality, this Civil Service Commission, it's taken on a lot of powers. The civil service has also used, this idea that it's established in law. It's the administrative permanent state now, and it's in statute. It's got more powers to become increasingly independent from the government of the day and the way it operates. So you have this situation whereby you might have a serving minister of the Crown who is responsible for areas like equality, diversity, and inclusion policy. Responsible for the Government Equalities Office, being told by the civil service, no, you will not tell us that we can't run our EDI initiatives in this particular way. You will not tell us that we can't hire X or Y to deliver our training, or that we can't do training. We're going to ignore you. This is how powerful the civil service networks have become. These unelected professional structures within the senior civil service, within the junior civil service even, as well. They've become increasingly a law unto their own self. Ministers feel cowed by it. And then you've got the quangos. And the quangos have become also, completely unruly over time. They're really hard to pin down. Quangos is a term to, public bodies that, are taxpayer funded, but they originally, it's meant to be non-departmental public bodies. But quangos is also used as a term for some of the executive agencies. And executive agencies are things like the Highways Agency, their structures, the Skills Funding Agency, Education and Skills Funding Agencies. They're much closer to ministers and they're delivery bodies. But they're all collectively these days called quangos, and they're powerful and they're very hard, I think, for ministers or for parliamentarians really to hold to account. And when I say hard, it's not a cop-out. It's just the reality here that, the quangos do run almost as a law to themselves very often. And you do get some brave ministers who try and take them on. And there have been people like Liz Truss, who's got a great book called 10 Years to Save the West, where she sets out a number of the battles she and some of her colleagues had to try and get serious reforms through when she was a junior minister and even when she was in cabinet. And the obstructionism and the tactics used, she lays it all out brilliantly. But Truss is not the only one to do that. There's a lot of people who can talk at great length about some of this. And what's gone wrong over time is increasingly the civil service has been politicised. It increasingly is very self-selective in the kind of promotion pathways that are on offer. It increasingly has thrown out the Northcote Trevelyan report principles of meritocracy. I mean, you're just seeing it at the moment with these kind of structures of how people will be appointed in the civil service. What were your parents doing when you were 14 years old? To determine whether you're working class enough to qualify for their new internship schemes. Things have gone completely mad. And it's only going to get worse, by the way, because one of the other parting gifts of the Brown government was to legislate for the Equality Act 2010. Another thing that David Cameron didn't oppose, even though there was a parliamentary wash-up. The government of the day has to compromise in those situations, and the Conservatives did not push on any of this stuff. But one of the things that was in the Equality Act 2010 that's is going to make this all much worse was a socio-economic duty. And how the public sector, now that was never implemented, that duty within the Act under the Conservatives, to be fair to them. But Labour have said, That's a priority. We're going to put that in. So they've recently consulted, and it wasn't should we, it's how do we best implement the socio-economic duty. So that's just going to make these kind of very discriminatory practices, not picking on merit, picking on other characteristics, all the worse in the coming years. And we've got to sweep all of that away, and this is where I think I'm going to bring this back to reform and its mission. So look, reform under Zia Youssef is saying it wants to shake up the model of British government. And I don't say under Zia Youssef, it's not just him. This, clearly the party is led by Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. But, Zia is playing a key role at the heart of the party, shaping, policy development and thinking about the structure of government. So that's why I say that. Look, Zia is rightly identifying big problems. And he's saying, we're going to have to make some changes. And the way I think that you can make those changes is to start planning in opposition, not just saying, what are the laws we're going to change, but it's actually starting to coalesce the teams that you're going to bring in and start building new institutions in opposition. Start building these things in shadow form, these new delivery mechanisms for your agenda that you can bring in either formally into government and designate them as agencies very quickly once you're in, or you can, work to commission them in the way that Michael Gove did the New Schools Network, which was a charity that one of his former advisors, Rachel Wolfe, set up in advance of the 2010 election to help deliver the Free Schools programme. And Michael came in and he was immediately being sort of, they were trying to paralyse that agenda by saying, oh, procurement rules mean you can't work with the New Schools Network. And Michael, at the time, to be fair to him, he really had the confidence to say, no, I am the Secretary of State. I have said this is a manifesto priority, going to deliver it. So he overruled the procurement objections and he designated the New Schools Network as its delivery partner for the Free Schools programme, which was a manifesto priority for the Conservatives. And that's the kind of approach that reform will need to take. So reform is going to need, I think, a network of different institutions around it, really focused on delivering developing and then delivering the agenda. And it's going to need to take control of the core executive again. It's going to need to rationalise, in my view, the number of Whitehall departments. It's going to need to shake up the structure of how the Cabinet Office at the centre, which is where a lot of power sits under the Cabinet Secretary, how that is structured. In my view, it should get rid of the Civil Service Commission and it should probably repeal the Civil Service, the Civil Service, Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. It needs new arrangements. These things were of their time. It needs to do away with a range of bad laws and get back to core basics. We need to look at the powers of the Treasury. We need to look at the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, all sorts of things that we can do. But, start building an opposition. And I have a thread where I set out some of those ideas, and I'll throw that up on screen, I'm sure, when I get to editing all of this. You can check it out. It's on my X account. It's called Upstream Fundamentals. I think it's pretty good. It's not it doesn't have all the answers, but it sets out my view on the kind of structures reform should be thinking about. And Lee Hurst, he also talks about this, about shadow civil service. He's right. We do need to start building this. I would say reform needs a kind of a strategy unit that's kind of separate almost from Party HQ, which are dealing with the day-to-day ruckus, Westminster, the battle and the campaigning. Reform needs a strategy unit that's focused on developing long-range policy and on developing the first 1,000 days. I'm not going to say first 100, it's got to be the first 1,000 days, because it's going to be a long-haul struggle over the first 3 years to grab the machine and make things work. Reform needs a strategy unit. Reform needs an institution builder, I also argue, in my thematic thread, Upstream Fundamentals. It needs an institution building kind of vehicle that will sort of help set up charities and other sort of organisations and work with think tanks over time. That's got to be the approach that reform takes. Reform probably needs a network of think tanks, bluntly, and it needs ginger groups, on a voluntary basis, and it needs proper delivery mechanisms. That's the only way we're going to be effective. So look, my appeal here is, let's get back to a core constitutional function whereby the elected government of the day is the responsible party of government, where most decisions sit with ministers of a significant nature, whereby ministers are not sitting on the sidelines saying, well, that's not my responsibility. That comes down to X body over here or Y body over there. They're totally responsible. Well, no, A, we don't need that many bodies. We need to have rationalized, limited and lean government in this country. But B, ministers should be ultimately accountable and responsible for all of the public policy decisions that are taken by the British government when it's involving the taxpayer. They are ultimately accountable. We need to get back to that core principle. We need to rationalise the size of the civil service. We need to look at its powers. Need to look at the way civil servants are appointed. It's not outlandish. Look at America, look at France. They have directly appointed political appointees who come in to run civil service functions. This is not abnormal. It happens in many parts of the world, in democracies, not just in authoritarian regimes where anybody shouts at the screen. It happens in all sorts of countries where there is a more political approach taken to the governance of the country, and where we recognise that human nature means that there will be people, long-standing civil servants, who are very much tied to the old regime, who should be asked to step aside, to move on, at a certain point when there is a sea change in British politics. That's got to happen. We've kind of got to get back to being rational. I would love if we were able to kind of reinvent the convention and work without having everything set down in statutory terms. That would be great, but we're not going to be able to do that overnight. So reform needs to develop the right laws. It needs to do a great repeal act, arguably. I'm not sure if you necessarily need to call it that, but a big repeal act on some of the kind of constitutional vandalism of the last sort of 35 years. But then it does need to put in place new laws, obviously, in some key areas to kind of deliver its agenda. But then what we need over time is fewer laws and better laws, and we need a constitution that again starts to work more by convention than currently does. And we need also to look at things like judicial review and really qualify where judicial review will apply and where it won't, because far too much at the moment is getting disrupted in the courts. Far too many things that have got a mandate from the public to actually deliver them are not being delivered because the government ties itself up in knots. It's got this government legal service that's always telling it to take the most precautionary approach. All of this has got to be reset, and we've got to kind of restore the idea that the elected party of the day, with a parliamentary majority, can govern without the law courts, without the quangos, constantly sticking their oar in, constantly frustrating any attempts to do anything meaningful. That's got to be the starting point for the renewal of our country. And let's not make any mistakes. Let's not make any bones about this. We are, we're not a failed state, but we are a failing state. This is becoming a post-prosperous country. Post-prosperous. How bad is that? We're becoming a country also where freedom is, very much on the wane. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen. And constitutionally, reform is going to need to be radical in a number of areas. We all know some of the problems with the Equality Act 2010 and the Human Rights Act 1998, but they are just two factors. There are these other kind of big laws like the CRAG that need to go. We need to have a civil service that is properly functional, and where the government of the day is not going to be paralysed and sabotaged constantly by a civil service that kind of operates as a law unto its own self and ignores ministerial direction and tries to run rings around circles, runs rings around ministers, and says, minister, you have no authority to do that. That sits with the quango. We need to clarify quickly who is in charge, who governs Britain, as the famous book by I believe Anthony Sampson set out. Who runs Britain? Who governs us? It has to be the elected government of the day. Now, look, one thing I will say, by the way, is I don't have a problem when I talk about the elected government of the day. Responsible party government doesn't just mean MPs. You can have peers. And Reform have talked about bringing in, people who don't want to be career politicians, who don't want a seat in Parliament for the next 15, 20 years on time limited basis to run things. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with some of those people becoming, leading some of the quangos that will stay on under Reform. I don't have a problem with them even serving in cabinet or on the front bench as ministers. That's a good thing. I'm not saying that, when I talk about responsible party government, it doesn't just mean MPs. We can be grown up about this. Ultimately, what matters is delivering outcomes, and I think we can get there. So yeah, I'm very optimistic that Reform can be radical, and I think it's got some good people at the heart of the party thinking hard about how it was. We're going to need, I should say, institutions and teams in place well in advance of the next election, wargaming the approach, wargaming the strategy that we will take in power, and thinking about the obstacles, thinking about the second bounce of the ball. All of that matters. It's the only way we're going to achieve anything. But if we don't take on what's called the blob, if we don't have a plan to defeat it, to actually take away its wrecking powers, its obstructionism, and to actually put in place the right fundamentals and the people to deliver them, then we're not going to get anywhere. Reform will be a failure. Reform will only succeed if it's got the confidence to live up to its name and reform the structures of the British government. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been an interesting episode to kind of put together, and I've got a lot more I can say on it. I didn't get to everything I wanted to talk about today, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do check out the rest of the channel. Do leave any thoughts, in the comments for this. And if you're seeing it on social media, on other platforms, leave your thoughts there. I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and maybe share this video. It's really appreciated if you do. Yeah, Cremin's Corner. Hope you've enjoyed it. Bye-bye.